Welcome everybody. As we are admitting the last few attendees, I'd like to first of all thank you to everybody who signed up to attend this morning's webinar. My name's Freya Horsfield. I'm the Policy Fellow with the Supergen Bioenergy Hub, and I'm delighted to be joined today by a number of colleagues in different roles who are going to share their research and practical insights around the questions around trees, crops and carbon. Just a couple of practicalities before we get into the substance of this. You'll notice that the session is being recorded. The intention is that we will record the whole session, but we will edit out the Q&A at the end, but the session will, the edited version of the session will be made available on YouTube, and there'll be a link to that on the Supergen website. We ask that all participants who are not presenting remain muted throughout, because we do have a number of people attending, and it can be distracting having intrusive audio. We're also going to ask people to raise questions in the Q&A function rather than in the chat function, because if we have a number of questions, it helps us manage and bring those together a bit more effectively. So without further ado, I'm just going to... Right, can I ask everybody to stay unmuted, please? Right. Okay. Right. Okay. So, purpose of today's session is part of Supergen's convening, looking forward towards a biomass sustainability framework. And today we're going to discuss trees, crops, and carbon. Our purpose is to make research around biomass sustainability widely available to support stakeholders in their responses to the currently open UK government's common biomass sustainability framework consultation. We ran a webinar last week, which is now available through our website, and today's the second of that. We'll be the webinars are exploring some of the questions around biomass as a sustainable feedstock for energy and products, and highlight the role of biomass in carbon regulation and the practicalities of growing and trading biomass. Today we'll be hearing from several speakers. Carly Whitaker will be talking about Introduction to Forest Carbon. Jeanette Whitaker will be talking about biomass sustainability at research at UKCH. Jamie Rickaby will be talking about the practicalities of making a living growing carbon-friendly crops. And Fiona Matthews will be talking about the practicalities of sustainability reporting in international supply chain. And then we'll have a Q&A session at the end. So please feel free, as the presenters are talking, to pop your questions in the Q&A function rather than the chat. So a very quick overview. This is from the government consultation slides, focusing on it's the intention of the UK government to make sure that only sustainable biomass is used, is considered to be low carbon. And yes, that's Katrina. And this is just an outline of the consultation. That the government consultation is open to the 27th of February. It is a very long and complicated consultation document with multiple elements to it, but this is a kind of bird's eye view of the structure of the main topic areas in the consultation document around feedstock and categories, definitions, land criteria, greenhouse gas criteria, and monitoring, reporting and verification. The aim of this framework is to be delivered as a policy document initially, possibly paving the way then to additional legislation if necessary, to be applied to biomass feedstocks that are used for bioenergy subject to government support mechanisms in the UK. The stated intention that it could be used also as guidance by the unsubsidised market on a voluntary basis, and that the whole package be reviewed regularly, updated, possibly every 5 years. Some overarching principles for developing sustainability criteria were identified: maximising carbon benefits from bioenergy use, minimising wider environmental harm associated with bioenergy supply chains, align with wider government objectives and policies for related sectors, align with criteria used in other countries and regions, for example, the EU Renewable Energy Directive, deliverability and cost to government, businesses and consumers. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing with on my section. I'll invite Carly Whitaker to give her presentation, please. Carly.
Thank you. Thanks, Freya. I'm just going to present from my current slide, and can I just check that that's working? Wonderful, great. Hi everybody, I'm Carly Whitaker. I work as a senior carbon scientist at Forest Research. I'm here to do a brief introduction to forest carbon, and just to say straight up that the content we present here is independent of the consultation. It's based on our previous research that we've happened at Forest Research. So in like slightly less than 10 minutes, we'll talk about some forest carbon basics in terms of how we look at how carbon stocks develop in forests, and talk a bit about how we look at the relationship between that and forest-derived biomass. So this is, so everybody knows that trees or plants remove CO2 as they grow and store it in their biomass. And if you used to take a fresh area of land and establish, this is like a hectare, establish a forest, you'd see the carbon and take carbon measurements throughout this time, you'd see the carbon stocks increase in this type of formation over this sort of pattern over time. And this has been demonstrated in sort of the growth and yield modelling that has been done extensively. So you'll see three phases that we kind of split this into. So there's the establishment phase where trees are establishing, and then it reaches a full vigor phase where it's like reaching its maximum sort of peak increment. And then it goes into a mature phase where the trees start to decline in growth rates, and also just like they start to peter out as well in terms of like trees per hectare. This is an unmanaged stand, so I wanted to start with a sort of message, like some key messages, that this is like a forest that's been left unmanaged. It doesn't mean that the forest carbon stocks are going to continue to increase indefinitely. They tend to reach an equilibrium where the growth slows, balances out with losses through decay and death. And also another key message here is that they are not permanent stores. They are able to lose carbon due to harvesting, as we'll talk about next slide, but also through natural disturbance that can happen. And there's lots of things kind of bashing forests at the moment. So that's important to appreciate. And the main reason why I'm pointing this out is that there's a kind of like a argument or a suggestion that forests should be left unmanaged because that's best for carbon, but the forest sector in general does not see it that way. It's not good for carbon, it's not good for biodiversity either, but I think there's definitely an appreciation that management is important in some way to protect carbon stocks in forests. So this is an example of a hectare that's being managed on rotation, and you'll see the carbon stocks would increase and decrease as you get your growing phase, your harvest, when it's removed from the forest, and then it regrows. And if you look at the carbon stock of that forest, it really would depend on where you were looking at it at that particular time. So when we would look at this, we would try to draw a sort of average sort of over time of like what's the average carbon, the long-term average carbon stock of the forest that's managed in that particular way. And the height of that line can really depend on lots of functions, which makes it a bit difficult to unpick exactly what's going on. Sometimes when carbon stocks are declining or increasing, it can be dependent on the tree species selected initially, or on restocking, the growth rates of trees, how long between different harvest phases, and also how the forest is managed between those sort of harvests, or even if it's not clear-cut harvest at all, there are different methods to harvest that aren't involving a clear-cut mechanism. Also how residues are managed can affect the carbon stock story, and also the soil type can impact it too. There's a lot of moving parts, but the general theory is that if the management is kept same in terms of the way that the species that are grown, the rotations and the management, if that's consistent, then the carbon stocks there will also be expected to be consistent if you drew this sort of line going across the peaks and troughs. But usually this is a per hectare stand, and we usually look at carbon modelling because it's very rare that you'll be working like this. You're working from a system, a forestry system, which will be made of like things at various stages of the cycle that we showed before. And so if you want to draw a line across this, it really depends on what areas you pick to examine. And that's why scale is very important. And with any given scale, there'll be areas that could be managed more or less intensively, and they'll be at different phases of their cycle. So if you was to look at areas where growth is actually higher than harvests, then the carbon stock will look like it's increasing. If you look at a mature area where the growth has kind of petered out or kind of like slowed down and the trees are ready for harvest, then it will look like the carbon stock is decreasing. And if you have an equal area of both of them, then it will look pretty flat. So just to say that the scale of how you do this assessment and how you make that judgment is really important to this sort of long-term analysis of carbon stocks. So moving on quickly, the biomass sector. So we talked about that line is dependent on many factors. There's been quite a lot of work trying to ask the question, what does the biomass sector do to this line? Does this affect it in any way? It's a bit more tricky it's tricky to understand because biomass arises, comes to the table, if you like, via various routes. So it comes directly from the forest, it can come from secondary processing, and it can also come from waste as well. Like it's various points at which this can appear. So if we're looking at a deep dive into the literature in terms of what statements and views of like what the biomass sector is doing, I'd say there's like two kind of views. I'm not saying that they're opposing, but they're just two clear views that appear. Both of them agree that the biomass market uses the lowest value products there. There's not much evidence to suggest that that's not the case, but the two views are that biomass has a very low value, too low a value to impact harvesting or management decisions. And in that case, there's no clear relationship between the biomass market and forest management decisions. The answer is there isn't a connection, and it doesn't influence that. Whereas the more sort of like you say, it's like a positive contribution that biomass is making to some areas where it's encouraged sustainable management of forests where there wasn't previously the case, or there are risks to that woodland. And then the message there is that it means that the biomass market is causing a change in forest management. And ideally, if we're looking at the carbon stocks, it's good to understand what the impacts are and the context of what has changed and why. Because the carbon stock changes could be positive, they could be negative, or they could be neutral. So it's kind of the route of research that we've been going down. And we've been looking at outcomes in terms of under what conditions does a given supply of biomass have a positive outcome on carbon, and how do we avoid negative impacts in terms of how like sustainability criteria operate, for example, how to avoid that. And we're asking questions like, what are the risks based on our knowledge of the current supply and practice? What are the risks associated with any biomass supply? What information do we need to know to mitigate risks or check a risk before it becomes an issue? And how do the risks apply to different feedstocks? So it talked about it coming from different phases, and that the risks would therefore be different for different types of feedstocks. And I've given a little QR code for where this comes, and the flowcharts are really interesting in terms of all of the different ways that biomass can come to, and how that has an impact on potential carbon outcomes. And if you want to explore more, and we've got some really nicely digestible content on the Climate Change Hub or the Forest Research website. There's another little QR code there. Got lots of information around carbon cycles, how carbon is affected by forest management, and the role of wood products, and various other things. So we released that just last September, so it's kind of still fresh off the plate. So thank you very much for listening. That's me done.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Carly. Thank you. Thank you. Right. So I'll invite now Professor Jeanette Whitaker to present.
Right, the slide's working. Oh, there we go. So thank you very much for the introduction to present today. I've been asked to talk about the biomass sustainability research that UKCH has been doing over the last few years. Obviously in 10 minutes, this is just a fly through of some highlights, and I'm happy to follow up with more detail if anyone's interested in particular areas. So the research we're doing in biomass, on biomass in CEH is really focused on climate mitigation, the co-benefits and the trade-offs that can be accrued. And our work focuses differently from Carly's in that we focus on perennial biomass crops, which can be grown in the UK. And the questions we're really addressing are what should we grow, where should we grow, and how should we grow biomass crops to maximise those environmental benefits, so not just carbon savings, but the wider environmental benefits that can be achieved. And in addition to that work, we also have teams in UKCH with a lot of expertise around air quality and atmospheric chemistry. So I'm also just going to touch on some of the research that we've been doing there on biomass production and use and the air quality impacts of that. So first of all, what should we plant if we're growing perennial biomass crops in the UK? So the crops fall into these four groups: the short rotation coppice, such as willow, short rotation forestry, species such as eucalyptus, which are grown over a longer time horizon. We've got perennial grasses, such as miscanthus, which is harvested on an annual basis. And then forbs such as cedar and silphium, which are grown at really small scale and a bit more experimental at the moment. And all of these 10 crops are currently grown, demonstrated and monitored at the Biomass Connect demonstration hub sites, which we've set up across the UK in the last couple of years, to really go beyond miscanthus and willow, which are the two crops which are currently grown most widely in the UK, to really look at what grows well in different parts of the UK and for different purposes. And so if we think about where should we plant, there's two things that we're really concerned about and interested in. The first is yield, because the yield of biomass that you produce per hectare of land really drives the carbon savings and the climate mitigation benefit. And we've got a really good understanding of the yield of willow and miscanthus particularly from work we've done looking at different varieties and modelling with colleagues. But we also know that the soil carbon change, which you get when you change a land use, so example, if you take an arable field or a grassland and convert it to biomass crops, the soil carbon that you can gain or lose through that process is also a really important aspect of the total carbon savings that you can achieve. And so knowing where is the highest risk or where is the greatest potential gain for soil carbon across the UK is important. And it's something that we've been trying to improve the certainty on that data over the last few years. So at UKCEH, with colleagues at the collaborators across the bottom of the screen, we've done a lot of work digging lots of holes across fields all over the UK over the last kind of 15 years or so, trying to improve our numbers. And in recent years, my colleagues at University of Aberdeen, Astley Hastings and Anita Shepherd have done some really sophisticated modelling to improve the numbers. So we can say now that soil carbon is really important, and it really depends on the starting point. So if you've got a low carbon soil, you're more likely to get a benefit. And if you've got a high carbon soil, you're more likely to have a loss. And we can put a number on that, which says that 120 tonnes per hectare is the threshold where that risk or gain can be achieved. And so the graph on the right really shows those high risk areas are the uplands in Scotland, the peatland soils, the uplands in Wales and some areas of England. But there are large parts of England and Wales and Scotland where you could get gains. This does vary with climate scenarios, and there's a whole load of complexity around this, but I think those clear messages are important to take forward. So another aspect of where we should plant are another type of soil. So in addition to conventional arable and grassland soils, we've got a lot of degraded peatlands in the UK. So peatlands are our largest terrestrial carbon store, but our peatlands are a bit knackered, to be honest. You know, we've been ploughing them, we've been degrading them, mistreating them, planting trees on them, and they are a big source of emissions. But there is an alternative way that we can manage these lands. And so this is a work led by my colleague Chris Evans in UKCEH, really demonstrating how we can take these drained agricultural peatlands where we've been losing enormous amounts of carbon. These are in East Anglia in the Fens, and really showing how we could differently farm them through a method of paludiculture, which is essentially we re-wet the peatlands. So on this picture here, this big channel around the miscanthus is a drainage channel that's being filled with water, and we're actually raising the water level in these fields and then growing the biomass, the miscanthus, in wetted conditions. This stops the carbon in the soil from going into the atmosphere, and it also helps with carbon sequestration into the soil. These crops are being grown as biomass. The biomass is then being converted into biochar, and the biochar is being put back into the soil to really help build those carbon stocks. And these are a whole range of projects looking at these in a novel way of farming. And what they've shown is that with this kind of combined re-wetting biomass biochar mechanism, we can shift these lowland peatlands from a source to a sink. So we can still get valuable crops from these really high yielding soils, but we can do it in a way that protects the carbon, and it's got real potential as a climate mitigation strategy here. So then how should we plant? So in the Perennial Biomass Crops for GGR project, again with the collaborators on the screen, we've been doing some experimental work looking at comparing the current best practice, so the current way that miscanthus and willow are planted, with some novel managements and planting techniques to see if we can maximise the yield of the crops but minimise the greenhouse gas emissions, so get those co-benefits. And here we've compared current best practice with strip till, which is essentially just ploughing the soil a lot less, just cutting strips and planting into them, herbicide-free and cover crops. And we've done this at 2 sites in the east and west of England on arable and grassland. And I'm just going to give you one slide on data. There's a whole load of data around this experiment, but just to give you an example of what we've discovered. So here on the left, you can see this is the willow planted on the grassland and the arable in these 2 charts. And the area with the ring really shows that the current best practice, so the red, gives you a good yield. The strip till in the blue gives you a bit of a yield penalty, but then the strip till with the biochar, the yellowy mustard one, actually recovers that yield penalty. So the biochar is helping with the nitrogen levels in the soil there, we think, and helping to achieve that yield. In the arable, we didn't get much yield penalty at all of these different planting strategies, which is good because these strategies are better for the soil and they're better for the environment. So we're getting those benefits, but without the yield loss. And then we looked at nitrous oxide emissions, and we saw actually slight declines in nitrous oxide emissions. And nitrous oxide is a greenhouse gas. And again, the strip till and the strip till with biochar have got potential to suppress those N2O emissions. So these are plot trials. They're not commercial scale, but they definitely show that we can amend the planting strategies for these crops, and we should be doing more work here to see how we can do that to get this kind of the best of both worlds in terms of yield and GHGs. So finally, in my last couple of minutes, I'm just going to talk about the air quality work at CEH. So at CEH, we do an enormous amount of monitoring and measuring. So we run some of the air quality monitoring networks for the UK government, and we have very sophisticated modelling groups working at local, national and international scale. And the work here has shown that our air quality impacts of domestic wood burning, so this is stove scale burning of wood. And in Scotland, this is a significant and is actually the largest source of PM 2.5. But another area that we work on is also looking at the direct ammonia emissions from anaerobic digestion. Now, anaerobic digestion is currently more common in rural areas, and ammonia emissions are quite a local issue. And so with in low population areas, this is less of a concern for human health, but it is an increasing issue for urban areas due to expansion of food waste AD in urban areas. And so that's something that we're going to be doing more work on in the future. Now, it might seem intuitive to think that there's potential air quality impacts from using biomass, from burning or processing it other ways, but there are also air quality impacts from actually growing the biomass. So trees emit volatile organic compounds, and these are precursors to other atmospheric pollutants. So if we massively increase the areas of trees, we may increase volatile organics, and that has human health potentially impacts. We have really good emission factors for conventional forestry. We've been doing conventional forestry for years, but for some of these newer species, we don't have such good data. And again, that's where we're trying to improve our information. But we also know that there are real benefits from planting trees. And so what we're trying to calculate now is, okay, we might get more VOCs, but those forests, they actually capture particulates too in their vegetation. They can act as barriers around farms, around roads. And so there's also a lot of positive benefits. And from the early work we've done, it looks like that planting trees is actually a net benefit for air quality. And so really weighing up those trade-offs and consequences is important. So that's me, a flyby of some of the work in CEH. I hope that was interesting. And as I say, happy to follow up with any future inquiries around any of that work or pass you on to my colleagues.
Thank you, Jeanette. Fascinating, thank you. So just to remind people that please do feel free to pop questions to our speakers. If you could use the Q&A function, and we'll pick those up at the end. We're recording all of this, although the question section will be edited out, so none of the questions will be going up on YouTube. So feel free if there's something you want to ask. So may I invite now Jamie Rickaby to speak. Jamie.
Hello everyone, and thank you for inviting me to talk today. So I've got a company called Willow Energy. We're based up in Cumbria, Carlisle, Cumbria, and I've been involved in the willow world for about 13 years now. And so I've been asked to kind of talk about, can you actually make a living at growing carbon-friendly crops such as SRC willow, short rotational coppice willow, which is what we specialise in. And hopefully by the end of this little talk I'm going to do, you'll have the answer. So I kind of wear three hats. I'm a farmer day to day, but I'm also a contractor. We contract our service out when it comes to willow, and also inventor. We're involved with quite a lot of projects, government funded projects when it comes to innovative machinery. But I'll give you a bit of background about willow first, and so you can kind of have a better understanding. So next slide, please, Dan. So the willow is planted much more densely than a traditional forestry plantation. We plant these little sticks, well, 20 centimeters long. We plant 15,000 of these per hectare. And the picture you see here is actually one of our step planters, one of our willow rod planters. With that machine, between 2 or 3 people, we can plant about 3 to 4 hectares a day of willow. Willow is a fantastic crop if you want to create biomass very quickly. We can harvest it after a 3-year period. We cut it right back down to the ground again. You'll see some pictures of that very shortly, and it'll grow back up again. So it's, from that point of view, it's fantastic. But there are some limitations to it in the sense of trying to encourage farmers to grow it, because it's in the ground for 25 years. It's not like a wheat or a maize crop, which you harvest annually. Normally in these presentations, I would go into all the pros and all the things you can do with willow and the positives about it. But for this presentation, because we're looking at research and the future of these kind of crops, I'm going to come at it from a slightly different angle. So if the next slide, please, Dan. I'm going to go into kind of more of the challenges of growing these types of crops. And the first one is the sheer volume, the amount of material that we can produce. So as I said, willow, from planting it within 3 years, we can have a good crop. If it's on good land, I think there's a bit of misconception that willow grows well on any types of land. Yes, willow will grow on any types of land, but to get the good yields, you need the better quality land. So in a long weekend, 2 or 3 days, we can produce 1,000 tons of willow chip biomass. You can see this great big telehandle on a great big heap. That's after a morning's work. So the challenges are, what do we do with that? A lot of boilers, or smaller boilers, can only take 10, 15, 20 tons, even 50 tons a week. So we end up with great big piles of biomass kind of sitting, waiting to be used. Even we supply some big power stations that use hundreds of thousands of tons a year, but they still don't want it all at once. So we end up with material sitting around waiting, and it can start spoiling, it can start composting. So from a research point of view, we need to think about, or our policy point of view, we need to kind of think about this. It's not like gas just flowing through a pipe. We need to think about, we produce all this material, then what do we do with it before it gets to its end use? The other area we need to think about is the moisture content. Obviously, when we're when we're harvesting willow, it's usually in the winter months when the plant's dormant, there's no leaf on it, but you have a high moisture content. It's coming off around about 50%. So every truckload that we ship out, 50% of it's water, which needs then to be dried. Do we dry it? Should we be drying it at source where we harvest it, or should we be carting it somewhere else to be drying? These are all questions that we need to be thinking about when it comes to research, but also around the policy. Next slide, please. And from my point of view, the question that's being put to me is, can you make a living at growing energy crops, particularly willow, from my point of view? And my answer at the moment is, it's very challenging and difficult. As you can see here, we've got 2 harvesters going. Each one's about £400,000 of a piece of kit, and then you've got tractors and trailers. You could easily be having almost £1 million worth of equipment in a field at once. And the problem we've got is, as that's been alluded to in other presentations today, is that the value of the material is actually very low, and the value hasn't really changed much in the past 10 years. Whereas machinery cost, labor costs, fuel costs, everything's gone up apart from the actual value of the material that we're producing. So it's great that we're doing all this research and putting all this effort and time into modeling and LCAs and things, but the reality is, at the moment, it doesn't really stack up financially from our point of view. We grow our own farm, and obviously we contract to others. Cost-wise, there's about it's like a third split. The farmer gets a third of the value. The contractor, i.e. us, gets about a third of the value, and then the transport costs each of about a third of the value. So a farmer could walk away with maybe £15 or £20 a ton, which just doesn't really cover the costs. Next slide, please. But we haven't been resting on laurels. We've been trying. We were fortunate enough to get involved in the Biomass Feedstock Innovation Programme in 2021. We've developed tracked harvesting equipment. One of the big challenges was that we should be harvesting in the winter months, but as we all know, the UK can be very wet, not just in the winter, but particularly in the winter. So we've developed a tracked harvester, which allows us to travel on wet ground. It means we don't have to have tractors and trailers in the field. It'll chop, chip, and then take the material to the side of the field and can be loaded straight into trucks. So we get efficiencies, we improve quality, and it allows us to get on at the right time. We've also developed robotic autonomous planting and harvesting for the planting rods equipment. So we spent 4 or 5 years developing all those kits. It's all there, it's ready to go, but I just don't feel as though there is the policy or the climate at the moment to utilize this equipment, which is quite frustrating from my point of view. Next slide, please. Yeah, I kind of feel as though we're stuck in the middle. We've got the government with policy throwing quite a lot of money at farmers in one way or another, whether it's through the Woodland Creation Grant, which is like £10,000 plus a lot of extras, so you can get up to £12,000–13,000 a hectare. But we're still not meeting our targets here. We're aiming for 30,000 hectares a year, and we're usually not getting half of that, or getting close to half. Why is that? Well, this is my personal opinion. I've been a farmer. We're not really that keen on permanency. It's permanent land use change, and farmers are always thinking about the next generation and what they will do. And we always know there's change coming. There's always going to be change, and the worry is by planting permanent woodland on farms, you're locking those pieces of land up for a long period of time. And my feeling is that's why we're not getting anywhere near these targets, because farmers just don't want that land use change going forward. And then at the other end, we're fighting against the Sustainable Farming Incentive, SFIs, which are paying quite large sums of money to take land out of production. For example, we've put some of our fields into wild bird mix, and we're getting almost £900 a hectare to grow wild bird mix. It's an easy income. We just grow up, plant it, shut the gate, and don't have to think about it for 2 or 3 years. It's a no-brainer. Whereas willow, we're stuck in the middle. There's no incentives, no grants available. but I feel as though we're the middle ground where we're not the permanent crops of like woodland creation, but at the same time we haven't got the short-termism of the SFIs, but we're not getting any support in that area. So we've gone from planting maybe 100 to 200 hectares a year to planting almost nothing now, because there's just no interest in this crop at the moment, because there are farmers' attentions are with other things. Next slide, please. Just going to this, I'm kind of trying to link it back to the framework that we're discussing as well here. And I think there's a lot of thought going into carbon store with planting trees, and we're all for planting trees to retain that carbon. But we also need to think about displacing carbon as well. So from fossil fuels, and I think that's where energy crops really come in. So I really just policymakers and researchers really need to think about, it's not just about locking carbon for a long period of time. It's about using natural resources to offset other kind of fossil fuel type materials and industries as well. So my ask is just to think about that when we are developing these policies and frameworks. Next slide, please. One of my biggest frustrations, and this is going to go against the grain here, because I know a lot of people are researchers and policy developers, but one of my biggest frustrations is that we seem to be in this constant loop, this cycle of launching biomass strategies and consultations and then biomass policy statements. And I've been in, say, 13, 14 years. I just worry that we're spending all our time and effort on getting the right data for the current policy statement or the current strategy, but we're not actually thinking about how does this work financially for people? How do people actually make a living out of this? And I'm kind of a bit worried at the moment that we're going to 2026 and we've got the biomass research program, which is launched, and then we've got the common biomass sustainability framework consultation. Some of these projects aren't going to end until 2030, and my worry is we're not actually going to get any meaningful policy around this until the 2030s now. So I just feel as though time is ticking by and nothing meaningful from my point of view. I know all the research is useful, but from my point of view, we're not really getting moving forward in any sense at the moment. So I'm quite frustrated in that area. Next slide, please. So what are we doing? You hear me complaining there's no money in wood chip, and to us there isn't. So we're pivoting. We're going to look at what else can we do with willow. So there's been some really interesting research coming out of Queen's University in Belfast, which is suggesting that cattle and sheep eating willow leaf, the methane emissions can be reduced by between 27 to 30%, which is fascinating. So we're looking at whether we could be maybe looking at some sort of feed supplements for that. We're also looking at making composts, peat-free composts, animal beddings with the material instead, where we're able to get a higher value than just sending it to a power station and it combusting. And we're actually working with some partners in Denmark who are developing some kind of willow extract for the cosmetic industry. And that bottle on the top right-hand corner there is actually Beyonce's, one of Beyonce's latest hair products. And they've managed to get some of their willow extract in that product, which is quite exciting, quite novel. So we're not resting on the laurels. We are trying our best to come up with other things. But the irony is that we're talking about biomass, and I'm actually scaling back and coming out of the biomass industry and looking at other uses. So the next slide, please, the final one, is that my parting shot is that at the moment we're actually parking our machinery up. I'm scaling back my business when it comes to harvesting biomass. The margins just aren't there. And I'm worried again about the way policy is going, but we keep having more and more projects around data collection, but there isn't any policy. And I worry that by 2030, a lot of the businesses that were involved in planting and harvesting just won't be in business anymore. So my plea is, can we start making some policy and helping the industry grow rather than go backwards? Thank you very much. Sorry to be a bit negative, but we need to be realistic.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you. Can I invite Fiona Matthews to talk to us, please?
Thank you very much.
On mute, there you go.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm Fiona Matthews, I'm a director at Hawkins Wright. My presentation is going to change tack slightly to look towards a more international picture. So discussing some of the practicalities of sustainability reporting with a focus on large-scale biomass users sourcing some of their requirements internationally. So I won't say much about Hawkins Wright, except that we are a UK-based consultant and we are publishing regular reports and providing consultancy services, tracking the global biomass markets. So the first thing I want to do is just set the scene, if you like, for what large-scale biomass users need. And I think the first thing to recognise is the scale of the investments that these types of end users are making. So we may be talking about single-site end-use facilities with an upfront capital cost of over £1 billion. And in order to finance large investments like that, lenders and investors require the biomass feedstock supply to be de-risked. And so they must carry out due diligence on the biomass supply strategy and verify that the suppliers and the sourcing is deemed creditworthy or bankable. Obviously, large scale means large quantities. We're talking about single site users, which may require 1 million tonnes per year of biomass supply. And these users span multiple end-use sectors. We're not just talking about power stations. Looking ahead, we may be also considering bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, or biochemicals, or potentially sustainable aviation fuels. Another part of the de-risking of the supply is that the end users need to know that if they were to have a technical outage and their facility was to stop operating, that the biomass that they have contracted to purchase could be resold to another supplier. They can't risk building up an inventory for which they have no alternative home. So the biomass must be tradable or fungible with other end users. They also need to know that there is a fair and sharing of risk in the supply contract. So it can't be solely the buyer that takes on all of the risk of the supply. They need to be able to share some of that risk with the supplier. And those risks could be economic, so production cost risks. They could be policy related, sustainability compliance, for example, or other forms of risks need to be handed up the supply chain in part. And obviously the biomass that they're purchasing needs to be at a price which is economically viable and competitive in the international market. And so the reason that international biomass plays a role is that domestically sourced biomass can't always fulfill these requirements. And that means that imports are a necessary supplement to local sourcing for some large end users. So here I want to just describe what a typical supply strategy may look like for such a large end user. And really what we're looking at is a portfolio approach where a user will buy biomass of potentially different types from a large number of supply countries and in fairly complex supply chains. So these are multiple countries, multiple different transport modes, several different handling steps. We may be in some cases at ports looking at commingling of product of different origins, so pellets that have been produced by several different players. And we are also looking at types of supply chain actors whose roles may change. So in some cases, end users may have a level of upstream vertical integration where they also produce some of the product in-house in their own producing facilities. And obviously through complex supply chains such as those, we're talking about a very large number of supply chain actors. So for a single large end user, they may be receiving product through 3 ports. Those ports may be receiving pellets from 5 different producing companies, who in turn may operate 20 pellet mills, for example. Those pellet mills may be receiving wood feedstocks from hundreds of wood suppliers, so combining sawmill residues as well as feedstocks coming directly from forest harvesting crews. And in turn, those may be dealing with potentially thousands of individual forest owners. And for all of these actors in the supply chain, their level of knowledge and the certifications which they hold will vary quite significantly. So this brings a number of complexities when it comes to complying with sustainability rules for international supply chains. So I already said that there is a large number of supply chain actors at play, and all of these actors must offer data and take part in certifications. For example, annual audits through third-party certification schemes. In many countries as well, forest ownership is diverse, so users may need to collect data from a very large number of actors up the supply chain. And in each of these different supply countries, the types of documentation and evidence that can be collected may differ. So this requires the end user to become comfortable with and very well educated about the different routes of compliance in different supply countries. And obviously, this complexities in the supply chain brings a very large quantity of data that has to be collected and handled appropriately. And that brings with it its own IT challenges. There is also a group of commercial challenges that we need to be aware of. So, for example, large users in the UK may be dealing with a different set of sustainability rules to their competitor purchases in other countries or end-use sectors, and this may present a barrier to trade. In some cases, the buyers may find that some aspects of their supply chain emissions are in fact out of their control. For example, the presence of rail infrastructure varies quite a lot in different countries, and that may mean that in some supply chains it is not possible to use rail, and more of the product has to be shipped by road with higher transportation emissions. And a similar example is that different countries face different supply chain risks, and some regions, for example, are more prone to hurricane disruption, which can bring with it changes to logistical arrangements for suppliers from different places. And compliance by end users may also be impacted by changes in third-party country policies. So, for example, forest management policies may change in third countries out of the control of the end user or the buyer. And then finally, we've already recognised that many of these biomass fuels are low value and sourced from waste and residues, and it's not always possible for the buyers of such low value materials to influence the activities of these upstream players. They may be more focused on the higher value products such as the saw logs that they're producing, and not as amenable to changing their practices because of the requirements of the residue buyers. And then finally, around challenges on data and evidence, many countries use different types of forest certification schemes. So we may recognise FSC in this country, but elsewhere other schemes are more prevalent. So the Sustainable Forestry Initiative and the American Tree Farm Standard are just two examples of other types of forest certification schemes. So end users need to be able to adapt their compliance around multiple different certification schemes. Some countries as well, which are suppliers to the UK, may lack official documentation that can be used to prove traceability. So in some cases, a bespoke compliance approach may be unavoidable. So for example, a risk-based approach may be needed to fill in gaps where official documentation is not available in the supply country. And there's just one final point on data. In some cases, there may be a lack of available auditors or certification bodies, which can make compliance in some countries more challenging. So to wrap up, from our experience looking particularly on international biomass markets, we believe that a good framework of sustainability framework in the UK obviously needs to be preventing unsustainable practices and drive continued improvements in traceability and greenhouse gases emissions, but it also needs to recognise the commercial realities behind large biomass supply chains. And for biomass to continue to be deployed at scale in the UK, we need to ensure that regulations don't hinder the development of a liquid market for biomass fuels and feedstocks. And the framework needs to respect the regional differences in the supply countries with whom the UK partners, and obviously be workable for the types of complex supply chains which I've described today. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Fiona. That's absolutely fascinating insight into the practicalities. Quite daunting, actually, to think about that. So thank you to all our presenters.